Well, welcome everybody to a very special Department of Psychiatry Grand Rounds in honor of the work and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. Typically we have our Grand Rounds on Wednesday, on Wednesday, and today we're doing it on a Friday because it was Dr. King's birthday today. So I'm Caroline Nestro, and I'm the director of the Department of Psychiatry's Office of Diversity, Inclusion, Culture, and Equity. And I lead that office with Dr. Telva Oliveras, who's our Associate Chair for Diversity and Inclusion in the Department of Psychiatry. And together with our Diversity, Inclusion, Culture, and Equity Board that we call the DICE Board, which is a group of people from across our department, we've planned a variety of activities for a full week, beginning today and ending next Friday. So each morning we're sending out emails where we are doing quotes of the day and having people do some reflection exercises if they choose to do so. But we're also having some of our coworkers sing songs from the civil rights movement that we're going to be playing each day of this coming week. And I'll be posting in chat a little bit later a link to this morning's musical moment performed by Tim Owens, one of our clinicians at Strong Recovery. We have a few, just some housekeeping things. As we've been telling most folks probably every single presentation, we're not going to use the chat box for general conversation. That's just going to be for the panelists and for Steve Fasone and our interpreters. But we do have the Q&A box for all of you to put your questions in. And both myself and Dr. Mathis, who I'll introduce momentarily, will be monitoring those questions. And at the end, Dr. Mathis will make sure we answer as many as we can online. Also in the chat box, we'll be putting a link to an evaluation for today's presentation, and that'll occur probably about 12:40. Let's see. And I think that's most of what the housekeeping is. So I would like to introduce you all to Dr. Myra L. Mathis, MD, who will be really helping with the conversation for today and introducing the presentation and the other speakers. So Dr. Mathis is a faculty member and an addiction psychiatrist at the University of Rochester Department of Psychiatry in the Division of Community Psychiatry. She's a native Rochesterian and undergraduate and medical school alumnus of the University of Rochester. Dr. Mathis trained in general adult and addiction psychiatry at Yale University School of Medicine, where she served in dual chief positions as the program-wide and medical education chief resident. Dr. Mathis recently returned to Rochester and serves the patients of Strong Recovery, URMC's outpatient dual diagnosis clinic, providing a full range of addiction and psychiatric services. She is a contributing author to several peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. Her academic interests include health equity and racial justice, psychotherapy and psychopharmacology for the treatment of substance use disorders, the integration of psychodynamic principles into general psychiatric practice and medical education. So I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Mathis, and she will tell you about today's presentation and the additional speakers.
Good afternoon, everyone. And it is a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. I'm very excited about today's presentation entitled A Discussion on the Intersections Between the Civil Rights Movement, the Faith Community, and Mental Health. And I'm very pleased and honored for our co-presenters who will be joining me today. So I would like for us all to sort of, in the spirit of the topic of the conversation, think about this like a sharing of wisdom from the elders, an intergenerational conversation and discussion where you are a fly on the wall, or as you listen in on our conversation. I really feel that it is in the spirit of the kind of community that the faith community, and in particular, the Black church develops. And so as we discuss this topic, we will speak about faith communities broadly, but also the Black church specifically and its pivotal role in the civil rights movement and in its role, ongoing current role as a a strong and important community fixture and community resource, and how we can best partner with that resource in advancing the health of the Rochester community as a whole, but also the Black community more specifically. And so with that, I would like to introduce the co-presenters and the co-discussants in this conversation. So first, Reverend John Walker. So Reverend Dr. John S. Walker, a native of Columbus, Ohio, is a graduate of Morris College, Colgate Rochester Crozier Divinity School, where he received a Master's of Divinity, and Syracuse University, where he received a PhD in Religion and History. His time in Rochester began as a student in Colgate, where in 1968, he was one of several Colgate students who formed the Black Caucus Committee to create and demand, if necessary, a Black presence through recruitment and curricula at the seminary. Uh, these efforts would lead, following the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., would lead to a takeover of the seminary on March 1st, 1969. He was one of 19 Black seminarians in this rebellion. They held the seminary siege for 18 days, despite many threats, both internally and externally. Ultimately, this nonviolent protest and act of civil disobedience resulted in a victory for the students, and the Black Church Studies program was established in the fall of 1969. Following his tenure at Colgate Rochester Divinity School, Dr. Walker went on to a PhD program in the Department of Religion at Syracuse University, where he spent some time teaching, later moving on to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he became the assistant professor of church history at the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. He eventually would come back to Rochester, having teaching positions again at Colgate Rochester Divinity School. He currently holds an adjunct associate professorship here in our Department of Psychiatry. He has taught at Syracuse University, Nazareth College, Monroe Community College, and many other institutions. He also serves as the pastor of Christian Friendship Missionary Baptist Church and has been in that post since 1989. And he is the facilitator of our Clergy Mental Health Collaborative, which is a collaborative organization through the Department of Psychiatry with faith leaders in the Rochester community, where Dr. Walker provides leadership and facilitation and guidance. So we're very happy to have Dr. Walker join us for this conversation. Additionally, I would like to introduce Reverend Dr. James H. Evans Jr. He is an accomplished educator and scholar and the founding pastor of St. Luke Tabernacle Community Church in Rochester, New York, as well as St. Luke Tabernacle Community Church of Detroit, Michigan. The son of a Baptist minister, Dr. Evans is a native of Detroit, Michigan, and a graduate of the Cranbrook School and the University of Michigan. Following college, he received a Master of Divinity from Yale University Divinity School and completed his doctorate at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Following a tenure as associate pastor of Chambers Memorial Baptist Church in New York City, he joined the faculty at Colgate Rochester Crozier Divinity School, first as an instructor of theology and Black Church Studies, and then later as the dean of the Black Church Studies program and the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Professor of Theology. He went on to become the president of Colgate Rochester Crozier Divinity School, the first African-American president not only of this seminary, but of any major seminary in the United States. Dr. Evans is the author of numerous articles and books, including We Shall All Be Changed, Social Problems and Theological Renewal, We Have Been Believers in African-American Systematic Theology, Black Theology, a Critical Assessment and Annotated Bibliography, and Spiritual Empowerment in Afro-American Literature. Dr. Evans brings this wealth of scholarship and a heart for the Rochester community to this conversation. And so it is truly a pleasure for me to welcome both Dr. Evans and Dr. Walker to this conversation. And I will add, as a personal note, this is a real treat for me as the daughter of two pastors here in Rochester. our families have known each other for many years, and they are truly elders in the community. And it is a pleasure to be sharing space with them as we engage in this conversation. So as Dr. Evans and Dr. Walker join us, um, again, this is a facilitated conversation. So we will speak extemporaneously. We will enjoy some hopefully some witty banter and have a little fun while also getting some education. But if you feel moved, if something speaks to you, feel free to say an amen or raise your hand in agreement as we engage in this conversation. Dr. Evans, as we get started, I would like to just hear from you. Can you help us think about really the historical perspective in terms of the role of the Black church in the civil rights movement?
Well, I think this, thank you so much, Dr. Mathis. And I'll just say in front of all these people how proud I am of you. But let's get to it. Yes, the Black church in America was really founded and established because of the tension between two things. One is faith and the other is freedom. And there was a faith that they saw in as primarily as Christians, that they saw in the biblical text that they did not see actualized in their own life. And so they had a faith that told them that they were meant and designed and created to be free, but that freedom was not materialized. So the Black church always was shaped by this dynamic tension between who God said they were and what the world said they were. And so that gives the church its primary set of parameters and tensions. And the second thing I want to simply mention about the church, Dr. Walker could give you a whole course on African American church history, but the second thing I would want to say is that because of that tension between faith and freedom, what we call the civil rights movement was simply a natural public extension of the convictions of these Christians going back generations.
Mm-hmm.
And so when the modern civil rights movement was established in a Black church in Montgomery, Alabama, with the newly installed pastor, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. there, it was not a new creation. He stepped into a stream of struggle that predated him. So that was kind of a natural outflowing. The second thing I will say, just in terms of our conversation, is that the thing that made the civil rights so relevant then and relevant now is because there was a recognition among the parts of those leaders that America was yet an unformed and unfinished experiment, and that it was a collection of social movements. The abolitionist movement, the women's rights movement, the anti-slavery movement, labor movement. It was a series of movements. And therefore, America always had the potential to be shaped in ways that were more consistent with its ideals. So the Black church was basically, the civil rights movement was basically the Black church's contribution to the making of America. And I think that's important. And the final thing I will say is that we observe the contribution of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But here is the difference. It is not that we celebrate the person. We celebrate what the person represents and continues to represent. It is not lost upon us today that while Dr. King never sought political office, he was politically engaged. But in the last in the last election, the pastor who occupies the pulpit that he preached from is now the newest U.S. senator from the state of Georgia. So there is a continuation of his dream and a continuation of his commitment and struggle for freedom that we can see today.
Oh, those are some powerful reflections. Thank you, Dr. Evans. I particularly appreciate your setting the role of the Black church within a series of social movements in US history. And that the civil rights movement, the phrase that you use, that it is the Black church's contribution to the making of America. And it's this idea of conscious patriotism where for Black Americans, we are aware of the ways in which America has not lived up to its ideals. And yet we still believe in those ideals, uphold those ideals, fight for those ideals, and many have even died for those ideals.
Absolutely.
And that is a legacy. And as you said, it is the contribution of the Black church to the making of America. That's a powerful statement. And you make some parallels to our contemporary times, just thinking about the historical lineage and certainly Reverend Warnock's historic win in Georgia and the connection that he has to the congregation that Dr. King once preached from. And Dr. Walker, I wonder if you can help us think a little bit about, how Dr. King was viewed even at his time. And as we think about current social movements and past social movements, we recognize that at the time of the civil rights movement, there were resistances, and that's very clear. And now we look back on it and see the historical significance and see the importance of it in the American story. And I wonder if you can just help us think about what it means to be present with those tensions during the time of the movement and what we can learn from that today.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Mathis, and thank you, Dr. Evans, for um, a very enlightening period with respect to the ministry of Dr. King. I would like to offer maybe another page of Dr. King's labor and his ministry, simply because I personally feel that much of what is happening today is not only hypocritical, but it is beyond the scope of anything that was really affixed to the ministry of Dr. King. All we hear about now is love. All we hear about now is toleration. Well, those are good concepts in its own right, based upon what it means relative to an ideal that you spoke of, Dr. Mathis, this idealism that really focused around Dr. King. Well, Dr. King was more than that. And as a result of being more than that, he was a man who was totally rejected, like Isaiah 53, talking about Jesus who was to come. He was totally disadmired, disrespected, all for one reason. Now, let me get into that. Let's deal with this historically for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. King really came to the limelight in 1954, 1955, and 1956, after the victory was declared in Montgomery with freedom to ride the buses anywhere that people of color wished to sit. There were other things that captured Dr. King, his momentary clinging into life as a result of being stabbed by a person who was not in their senses, and the fact of his ongoing struggle to equip this nation with a type of position that was more relative to the Constitution for all people rather than relative to the Constitution just for white people. Dr. King was just what Dr. Evans had alluded to. In other words, he was a hero. He was a hero of Black people. He was a hero that really stretched our concept of commitment uh, almost to its limit. Many things fit into that. The killing of Emmett Till and other situations that we were powerless to do anything about. Then up would come our leader, and our leader was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a Baptist preacher, and one who looked upon his ministry as prophetic and as visionary. And he took that vision to the National Baptist Convention, the largest convention that we had in America with respect to Black churches and its people and its ministers, its pastors. But the president of the National Baptist Convention was a man named Joseph Jackson, who was eminently known for his conservatism and also known for his blockage of any type of movement within the convention that declared civil rights, that declared equality, that declared that this church that Dr. Evans talked about could not be involved in anything political. That was Dr. Joseph Jackson, a Black man. Many things have come to light, and that is the friendship that Dr. Jackson had with Mayor Richard Daley of Chicago. They were eminently very close. Mr. Dawson, the one political representative that we had from Illinois, was not. He was not close, even though he was a Democrat, he was not close to Mr. Daley. But nonetheless, in September of 1961, when the National Baptist Convention met in Kansas City, Missouri, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., still a member of the NBC at that time, brought to the podium this position that we must be involved in voter education, that the church must be involved in anything that speaks to oppression, because that is the history of the church, he declared. Dr. Jackson was so moved to anger and dislike of Dr. King, which he had never had before, that he organized a group of men to physically throw Dr. King out of the convention. Following Dr. King, just like the men that had the courage to follow Richard Allen in 1787, walked out with Dr. King. And in November of 1961, after a minister from Detroit was killed in 1961, there was a fist fight, a brawl among ministers.
Wow.
Over this whole question. And this man was killed, knocked from the pulpit, hit his head on the floor, and he died. Well, November of 1961, Reverend Booth of Cincinnati called for a meeting to discuss the possibility of pulling out of the the National Baptist Convention, and starting the PNBC, the Progressive National Baptist Convention. And chief at that meeting would not be Reverend Booth. Reverend Booth only called it, but the chief person at that meeting was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Cincinnati, Ohio, November 1961. And along with Dr. King and Reverend Booth and others, the Progressive National Baptist Convention was started. Hardly 20 people then. But we had a mainstay along with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. from the National Baptist Convention, a man who did not think at all like Reverend Jackson, and tried to bring his own leverage to the leadership of the NBC, and that would be Gardner Taylor. Gardner Taylor would be also later on in life, in his ministry, would come to Colgate, Rochester. He came just to visit us one time, spent about a week with us, those young black men who took over the seminary. And egging us on. He wasn't there to talk us out. He was there to egg us on, to push us, let stick to your agenda. That was Dr. Taylor. And he and Dr. King were kindred spirits in this movement. But there were other things too. I was a follower of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. I was a follower of him until September of 1963. In August of 1963, where we take from much of what was going on, the I Have a Dream speech, even though that has been cut off and cut into and dissected and even abbreviated, so that all we get is beloved passages. That wasn't all that Dr. King spoke of during that time. But from August 28th, 1963, until September 15th, 1963. Hardly 3 weeks later, 4 little Black girls were dynamited to death in a Black church.
Mhm.
In a Black church in Birmingham, Alabama. Their lives were blown off totally. And then Dr. King, on the next day, issued a statement saying that we should love the killers of these children. I didn't understand that. In my immediate allegiance switched from Dr. Martin Luther King to Malcolm X Shabazz, who spoke the way that I thought and who spoke the way that many Black people in America thought. But that's not what brought us to this point where we celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. King. We have to go back to 1967 to Dr. King's major speech, a sermon at Riverside Church in New York City, where he condemned as a capitalist adventure the war in Vietnam, condemned the killing of poor Black, poor white, and poor yellow men in that struggle. When he got back to the country because he had condemned the war in Vietnam, he received rejections on every hand from the Black church. Many members of the Black church pulled away from Dr. King. He also received this type of treatment from the NAACP, who no longer said they could support him, from the National Urban League, who withdrew their support. And those two organizations together generally held millions of Black people. But their leadership, Roy Wilkins and Whitney Young Jr., said no longer can we support Dr. King because of his inconsistency with respect to the Vietnam War. Dr. King called the war a war against war. He called the war a capitalist expansion. He called the war evil, immoral. And as a result, not only the National Urban League, not only the NAACP, but the labor movement withdrew its support.
Dr.
Liberal
Walker.
politicians, yes.
Yes. So,
you want me to?
well, I just wanted to jump in right here. I just wanted to jump in because you're bringing in some really powerful comparisons here. You're really bringing to light some historical tensions that many of us do not often wrestle with. And these historical tensions have to do with what it means to be politically engaged, what it means to be politically engaged as a person of faith, when you are a public figure, when you are leading a movement, and how that political engagement, those particular choices that we make to speak up against injustice can be interpreted and reinterpreted and misinterpreted in so many different ways that leads to, it can lead to a fracturing of a movement, but it also comes back to this core idea that Dr. King would lift up, and that a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
That's right.
Yes. Could I say, because Dr. Walker raises such interesting points. First of all, that any prophetic movement requires an avant-garde. It requires somebody who's willing to step out front. And out front is always a lonely place. If you want to have company, go to the back. But if you want to be by yourself, you step out front. That's first thing. So in 1968, in his last address called Showdown for Nonviolence, Dr. King said, everybody has deserted me on this nonviolent principle, but for me, it's a philosophy of life and I cannot abandon it. So I will follow it to the end. The second thing I wanted to mention is that when you are out front by yourself, and you can see this in the prophetic writings, when you are out front by yourself, avant-garde, who you really are and your fundamental commitments come to the forefront. Dr. King, most people don't know this, but Dr. King's original writings in the early 1950s were all about economic justice. His first published paper was about economic justice. As time moved on, that message got shifted and attenuated so that it became about social integration. But his original commitment was about economic justice. Now, why is that important? Dr. Dr. Walker mentioned the whole notion of love. Dr. King believed that justice is the political expression of love. You cannot have the political expression of love is justice. So you cannot talk about love when you run away from justice. And the final thing I'll say is that life seems to come full circle. That in his first paper, he talked about economic justice. And on the day before he died, he was struggling for economic justice.
Yeah.
It wasn't that Dr. King was not interested in the social aspect of racial reconciliation, but he understood that to talk about reconciliation without talking about justice was a kind of a empty exercise. And I think that these are the things that are certainly internal to the Black church. Dr. Walker has outlined to you this kind of fabulous historical development, this tension within the Black church between withdrawal from the political sphere and engagement from the political sphere. We continue to have to do that. But it appears to me that that is the inescapable identity marker of the African American church is its political engagement. And that happens whether we intend to or not. Let me just say this now, then we can open it up to get back to Dr. Walker. But you'll remember when President Barack Obama was running for office, and a 15-second video snip of a sermon preached by our good friend, Dr. Jeremiah Wright, became public. And there was such a grand uproar because, let me just put it this way, white America got a glimpse into what goes on in Black churches every day. And that is that every day we talk about the things that impact our lives. And that means that we must preach a gospel that is engaged in the political sphere, because that's the world in which we live. So there was a lot of shock on the part of people who had no idea what Black churches were all about. They didn't know what they preached, they didn't know what they sang. And therefore, there was a little bit of shock. But the fact of the matter, this is the identity of the Black church. And it struggles with its own identity, I'll give you that. But it can never escape the fact that the people who come into those doors on a Sunday morning are oftentimes survivals of political trauma all week long. And they need a gospel that is going to help them remedy what they experience during the week. So today, the Black church provides a space for sustenance, for clarity, for the recognition of your gifts. You may be a sanitation worker Monday through Friday, but you're chairman of the deacon board on Sunday, and that does something for you. Yeah. You may be a housekeeper at Holiday Inn Monday through Friday, but you are the head of the missionary board in your church on Sunday. And so those things actually are also part of the witness of the church. And I think when we get to it, I think certainly we can help people understand how this relates to the mental well-being of the Black community and what the church has to contribute to that.
Well, since you've already brought us to that point, let's talk about that a bit more. I am sitting here reflecting on so many different things. I'm thinking about the generational aspects of what we're talking about, the comparisons between the civil rights movement and our contemporary times. Really, for my generation, the Black Lives Matter movement is the outgrowth of the civil rights movement.
Yes.
It is our current a fight to see love expressed through justice. And when you talk about political trauma and racialized trauma, the repeated exposure to the death of Black men, women, and children at the hands of law enforcement, and in a very public way, that it's videos being replayed. There's a vicarious trauma that happens when you view that. And for the Black community, as a collectivist community, it is not, we do not see them as isolated incidents. We do not see it as something that happened in one city or in one neighborhood. When we see those incidents, it is as if it were us,
Right.
as if it were our brother, as if it were our sister, as if it were our parent or child. It is deeply personal. Again, because of the nature of our culture, we are not individualistic in that way. It is a collective culture, and we feel things as a collective. And so when you talk about the role of the faith community, and specifically through the lens of the Black church, in providing a space for psychological safety to buffer against the onslaught of racism that exists for Black Americans, it is a tremendous, tremendous strength of our culture and our community. It is a treasured institution in order to provide that sort of space, in order to give us a sense of identity and dignity, where outside of that space, too often our dignity is stripped from us, or we are viewing images where our lives are being devalued. And we come to these spiritual, cultural, and even social political spaces within our church communities to receive not just a sense of social support and connectedness, but a restoration of those broken spaces in our identity that have been worn down, weathering over time due to the onslaught of racism. And I do want to, I'm sorry, there was someone going to jump in.
I just think it's important to note that that one of the things that African American people do is there is a sense of identity across time and space. So because something happened to George Floyd, hundreds of miles from where we are, we feel it. The space, there's maybe physical distance, but there's no psychic space between his suffering and our suffering. The same thing happens historically, though. There is a hymn, I'm sure Dr. Walker knows it. It's called "Were You There When They Crucified My Lord?" Now, just that phrase, "Were you there?" says that somehow there's the time continuum means that I am present even in the midst of historic suffering. And this is what we see when we look back upon the enslavement of Africans. It is not just in the past. We continue to participate in
Dr.
that.
Evans, just let me intervene, just to throw this in. James Cone's book, written shortly before his death, 3 years ago, The Cross and the Lynching Tree.
Yes. So that's a powerful book. If people haven't got it, please get it on Amazon. It's called The Cross and the Lynching Tree by James Cone. Dr. Mathis is lifting it up. This is a powerful, powerful book. So we connect with that. I want to, I know at times it's getting short, but I want to just share one memory that came to my mind as I was thinking about this last night. If you give me just a minute to share this one memory. And it's a story from my childhood. I was about 5 years old, and my father was a pastor of a church, and my mother was the first lady. We lived above the church, an apartment above the sanctuary of the church. And one day we heard a knock at the door. My father went to the door, and he ushered in a man who I had recognized as a member of the church, but he was bloodied, and he was just he had been physically assaulted. They sat him down, and I remember as a child that he was bloody, he was confused. My parents hurried to attend to him, but he rocked back and forth, kind of traumatized by this assault. And he kept insisting that his pistol was underneath the sofa on which he was sitting. And I'm just sitting there just, listening to this. as if he could find a weapon, somehow he could undo the trauma of the assault that he had just experienced. He was eventually taken to the hospital, but even at that young age, it appeared to me that when he sought treatment from his pastor first for the spiritual damage that had been done to his spirit and his soul, before he sought medical attention for his physical wounds and maladies. And to me, that is just a memory I have from my own childhood, but I suspect other people have had that same kind of thing happen. And since we're talking about the Black church and its relationship to kind of mental health, the violence that we experience creates all kinds of psychic and moral injury.
Yes.
That that people oftentimes come to the churches to find some kind of remedy for. And while the African American church has its own set of experiences and historical resources, to me, it's a challenge to every faith community to respond to the injury, psychic and otherwise, that is done to people who are victims of violence, and to see if there is a way that maybe we could refashion our faith in a way that is more focused on the issues of justice. And I think that would be a good challenge for all of us to take at this moment.
Oh, well, thank you for those words, Dr. Evans. And as you talked about this young man who sought treatment from his pastor first, it does, of course, bring to mind this wonderful group that we have here in the department, the Clergy Mental Health Collaborative. And really the spirit of this group is to build collaborative partnerships between clergy members and mental health care providers, so that we can bring all of our resources together to meet the needs of the community. There is a spiritual and moral injury that you spoke to that a psychiatrist alone cannot meet, that a psychologist alone cannot meet. But there are clinical symptoms, for example, that while they may be ameliorated and buffered by the community and the safety that is provided within the church, they may not be fully addressed without that clinical component. And so we're very appreciative, again, Dr. Walker's facilitation of that group, yourself as a member and other clergy members in the city as members of that collaborative. And we do hope to continue to build those kinds of partnerships so that we can meet the needs of our community. And we do have, it's about 15 minutes to the hour. We are going to be responding to comments and questions in the chat. So if you have questions or comments, if something's been percolating in your mind, feel free to enter those in and we'll begin to address those. But I do want to just highlight a few summary points that have come up during our conversation. One, this line is just, it's embedded in my mind, that the civil rights movement is the Black church's contribution to the making of America. That struggle between our faith and our freedom and what it looks like to have freedom expressed in reality is the tension that birthed the civil rights movement. And that is a tension that exists within the social, cultural, spiritual, and political space that is the Black church. That as such a space, it provides a psychological safety and a sense of dignity in the face of the onslaught of racial trauma. And this racial trauma, as Dr. Evans explained so well, it has a unique relationship to time and space. And that what we see happening hundreds of miles away feels very personal, that it is felt as a personal trauma. And what we understand even through research within our field in terms of the intergenerational transmission of trauma, that is also borne out in the historical legacy of the trauma that African Americans have faced in this nation. But that our faith communities provide a space of comfort, safety, and buffering against that trauma. And that as we continue to meet the mental health needs of the Black community specifically, but then we think about the Rochester community more broadly, how do we partner effectively with our faith leaders who are tremendous resources, who can provide a salve, if you will, for the spiritual and moral injury, while we also bring our clinical expertise in a collaborative way to be able to meet the multidimensional needs of our community. So I'm seeing some comments and questions here. One comment, there's a comment asking if Dr. Walker could finish his thought on the reduction of Dr. King to love.
All right, thank you so very much. I'm afraid I'll stretch the time if I were to do that, because there's so much that occurred with the ministry of Dr. King after 1963 that most people don't know about. Certainly our young people have only a blur when it comes to who was Dr. King. They have nothing when we ask a question about who was Malcolm. They don't know. It's only because, number one, families have failed our young people as well as the church. I used to teach, well, I still do when I have the opportunity, but I used to teach that the Black church, above many things, was a cultural institution. Not only was it to deal with the moral and the ethical guidance of its people, but it was to deal primarily with our culture as something that God has wrought, something that God has blessed us with, enlightened us with. Our music is incomparable because out of the music of the church has come the blues, rhythm and blues, what we misname as jazz, everything that is prominent in our music and of our musicians themselves have come out of the church. The kind of church-led situation that we think about. Black Lives Matter, yes, absolutely. And I think, and I agree that that is an extension of the civil rights movement. That is Black Lives Matter. Me too, to some extent, but Black Lives Matter, certainly. But I'll share with you, as you have probably perceived already, that the leadership of the Black Lives Matter, the leadership of all of those protesting the villainous actions of law enforcement against unarmed people of color throughout this world for generations, was without the presence, basically, of leadership of members of the Black clergy. Where were they? Where were the ministers of Rochester? Where were they? Others took the lead. Others said things that they should be saying. So I'm not, I agree with the historical concept, and I agree with the historical application of what the Black church has meant. But at the same time, I'm well aware that the numbers of Black churches have declined radically. Other so-called mega churches have come up, but they're not saying or doing anything. They just have a lot of integrated people. That's all that they have. And I yearn. I know I'm getting old, but I yearn for the church to be as it was when I came into it. I yearn for those days. I yearn for those days. I learned for people who couldn't speak English very well. I yearn, including the pastor. I yearn for those days. I yearn when they were really committed first to God and then to their people. I yearn for that. I don't feel it anymore. I don't. And the reason I don't feel it anymore, I believe that it is less and less and less of a common denominator among our churches today. But if I might, just to move on, and I was talking about people and institutions that had been on Dr. King's side, but after the Riverside sermon, boom, no more. And also, I like to indicate Lyndon Baines Johnson and the White House he made a statement on television that they could no longer support the civil rights movement as long as Dr. King held that position that he held against the Vietnam War. Well, of all people, LBJ needed to hear that because he was in a stupor from the time he was given the presidency following Reverend Mr. Kennedy's assassination until such time as the Riverside. He had no knowledge of what to say about it. He trusted other people in his administration who were pro-war, who were pro-white, and who were anti-color of any description with respect to people. And as a result of that, Dr. King came in and actually took him off of the map by saying that the war in Vietnam is a war of capitalist adventure. That's all he said. That's what he said, and that's what he meant. And then finally, I like to say that the Clergy Mental Health Collaborative is, I think, a major instance of moving forward with this whole concept, because we're trying to deal with pastors, particularly, who have the same mindset as Dr. King and Malcolm, kind of woven together, like I do, and who understand that the masses of our people are still oppressed, are still under siege, and are still cut off by ways of injustice and brutality from achieving their wholeness as a people. And as long as we're down, to borrow a phrase from Booker T. Washington, as long as we are down, so will the white people of America be down. We rise, they rise. We go down, they go down further. And that is what needs to be understood, that as long as we claim to be Americans, then we claim justice, freedom, equality, and peace.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Walker, for those comments. I'm seeing quite a few questions in the chat, so I'm going to try and move us forward to get to as many as possible. So there's an individual who works on inpatient units and wonders about re-traumatization of Black patients by who are admitted to a locked unit where the majority of the healthcare providers are white. How do we increase our providers' awareness as well as an understanding of their implicit bias and or denial, and how can we more actively bridge people to Black churches? So this is an excellent question, comment, and I'll just speak to this briefly. And so I think first there's an awareness that we need to make sure there's an awareness of the possibility and the likelihood and the very high likelihood, the reality that Black patients feel re-traumatized by inpatient units. That while we have a clinical understanding that the locked units are done so for safety, the criminalization of mental illness and the criminalization of mental illness, particularly for people of color, means that they are more likely to be jailed when they are demonstrating symptoms of a mental illness than they are to receive treatment. And so there is this conflation between what happens when their mental illness is criminalized and they are put in a confined setting versus when they are admitted somewhere to receive treatment. So having an awareness and an understanding is very important. I believe that making sure that we have connections with as many people from that person's original support group as possible to be present in their treatment. Now, of course, certainly things like getting releases of information, all those things must be done clinically, but how do you incorporate someone's pastor into their treatment? Do you, when you're speaking with family members, do you get a release of information from a clergy member who might be able to, when we're out of COVID, come onto the unit, or even during COVID days, Zoom into a meeting so that they are providing support to the individual and to the team? So make use of the natural support system that exists for that individual when we don't have those same resources in our inpatient settings.
Well, let me speak first, because I know Dr. Evans is going to speak directly to this, but I would just say quite briefly that all medical institutions and agencies and hospitals should have a list of clergy who they can call to help the person through this trauma.
Mhm.
But I thank you for what you said. That's right on time.
Yeah, thank
Yeah,
you.
and I think it's a fundamental awareness. This is the broad learning curve for a lot of people. But as you know, Dr. Mathis, you know, the history of the development of psychiatry in America has really been shaped by racial policies that we have not really fully unpacked yet.
Mhm.
And so I think the more we can learn about how the discipline and the science itself has evolved and what kind of factors played into that, then we can begin to modulate our own responses
Right.
with some sense of awareness.
That is very important. Thank you for raising that. The historical legacy of racism within psychiatry is something we cannot ignore when addressing that question. We have just a couple minutes left. There are so many wonderful, wonderful questions and comments, and I really wish we could get to them all. But I will just offer that there is going to be a series during Black History Month, and we are thinking about how to continue this conversation during our Black History Month series to address some of the issues that we've only lightly touched on during the course of this conversation. And so I believe as we started the presentation with music, why don't we end with a reflection on music, which the department will be experiencing musical moments throughout this upcoming week in celebration of Dr. King. And that could we please speak to the role of music within the Black church? Wondering about the place of music as a tool in the transcendence of time and space and the power and meaning of the Black church. I know that's a dissertation in and of itself, but if we could just
Yeah.
end with a reflection
Yes.
on that.
Yes, and let me just state that the music of John Coltrane is a powerful indicator. It is the most powerful invocation that we have of the power that Black music has spiritually in us. I recognize that. I kind of experienced it. I know that Train's music was mystic and that we are a mystical people and that we are caught up into this whole aspect of who we are by the way that much of our music defines us. And the way that our music has defined us is the way that we truly, truly tend to give ourselves to this world.
Let me just say just a final quick comment on that. I'm not an expert in this field, but I'm aware of some work that has been done that suggests that music, especially certain kinds of music, has important therapeutic effects on people. And that's why the old, what we call field songs or slave songs, some kinesiologists really believe that these songs actually increase the physical strength of people working in the field. So music, I think, is multidimensional. It is not just entertainment. It is itself a form of sustenance, support, and if necessary, therapy.
Wonderful. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
It looks like we're at the end of the hour and we're going to have to finish this conversation for now. But as Dr. Mathis said, we're looking at doing a series of conversations for Black History Month in February. And so we hope to see you all at those and you'll get more information about them as we move forward. Thank you, everybody, for this wonderful conversation today. Very, very impactful.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Look forward to seeing you next time.
Yes. Special thanks to our interpreters for the deaf community. God bless you. Thank you.
Mhm.